Don't drink that. The warning came too late, softened by music and laughter, swallowed by the warm glow of the banquet hall. Elena Vale had already lifted the small silver vial to her lips, her fingers steady, her smile calm in a way that made the women around her look uneasy. The Moonstone court had spent years calling her fragile, inconvenient, unworthy. They said she was too quiet to matter, too plain to be chosen, too loyal to notice when people twisted the truth around her. And tonight, beneath the chandeliers and the pale winter candles, they had invited her here like a decoration, something to stand beside the powerful and be forgotten by morning. Elena knew that. She had known it for years. Still, she stood straight in the middle of the room, her dark dress simple against the shimmer of silk around her, her heart beating with a strange, aching peace. The silver liquid caught the light as she looked at it. It was not supposed to taste sweet. It was not supposed to feel like this. But her smile never changed. Across the hall, at the high table, King Adrian Blackthorn watched her with the cold stillness of a man who believed he had already won. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the Western Territories, feared by packs and praised by courtiers, a man whose gaze could silence a room. He had rejected Elena 5 years ago in front of everyone, then accepted another woman at his side not long after. She had never begged. She had never raised her voice. She had simply carried the wound in silence and learned how to breathe around it. But tonight, something about her seemed different. She did not tremble. She did not plead. She only held the vial with both hands, as if it were precious, and brought it to her mouth as the court held its breath. "Elena," someone whispered behind her, nearly panicked now. "Put it down." But she drank. The silver poison slipped down her throat in one careful swallow, and for one brief moment, the entire hall seemed to stop. No gasp came. No dramatic collapse. Just Elena lowering the vial and closing her eyes, as if she were listening to something far away. The king's brow tightened. He leaned forward, just slightly. It was the first crack in his control. Elena opened her eyes again and looked directly at him. There was no accusation there. No anger. Only a quiet sorrow so deep it made the air feel heavier. Then she said, in a voice soft enough to haunt the room, "You were always looking at the wrong woman." The words moved through the hall like a cold wind. Adrian's expression changed, though only by a fraction. He stood, the scrape of his chair sharp against the silence. Something in his chest tightened in a way he could not name, a warning too old and too familiar, the kind that comes before memory turns cruel. Elena's smile remained, small and heartbreaking, as the candles flickered around her face. She looked almost like someone welcoming dawn after a long night. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Elena. Elena did not move when the room began to stir. She only sat there with her hands folded in her lap, the silver cup resting empty beside her, the faint sheen of poison already disappearing into the light on her lips. Around her, the banquet hall seemed to change shape. Laughter thinned into uneasy silence. Conversations broke apart in half-finished whispers. Even the musicians at the far end of the hall faltered, their fingers hovering above the strings as if they had suddenly forgotten the next note. Adrian remained standing near the high table, his gaze locked on Elena as though he had only just noticed she was real. Not a rumor. Not a shadow. Not the plain Omega everyone had trained themselves not to see. She sat there with impossible calm, her pale face lit by the candles, her expression so gentle it made the entire hall feel cruel by comparison. The healer beside the dais stepped forward at last, pale with alarm. "My king," he said carefully, "she must be taken to the chamber at once." Adrian did not answer. His chest felt tight, his thoughts moving too fast and too slowly at the same time, each one scraping against the next until he could hardly breathe. He had seen Elena in halls like this for years and looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. He had listened when others dismissed her. He had allowed the court to treat her silence like weakness. And now, with one small smile and one terrible cup emptied before him, the shape of his failure began to reveal itself in pieces too sharp to bear. Elena lowered her eyes to her own hands. They trembled once, just once, before she stilled them. "Do not make that face," she said softly, her voice thin but steady. It carried farther than it should have, perhaps because no one dared speak over her. "You always hated when I cried." The words landed quietly, but they struck with the force of a bell in the dark. A few women looked away. One noblewoman pressed her fingers to her mouth. Adrian took a step forward, then stopped, as if some invisible wall had risen between them. "Elena," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth seemed to surprise even him. She finally looked up at him. There was no pleading in her eyes. No desperate hunger for forgiveness. Only the deep, exhausted patience of someone who had spent far too long being overlooked. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had the sudden, sickening memory of silver-blue moonlight on a hidden garden path, of a girl with trembling hands offering him water when no one else would come near, of a soft voice saying his wounds would heal if he stopped pretending he felt nothing. The memory came like a blade of light through fog. It was not Elena he had remembered. Or rather, it had been Elena all along, only younger, quieter, standing in the wrong clothes, under the wrong name, in the wrong life. His breath caught. "No," he whispered, though he did not seem to know what he was refusing. The healer turned sharply. "My king?" Adrian did not look away from Elena. The hall had gone so silent that the crackle of the candles sounded like rain. Elena's lashes lowered. She seemed smaller for a moment, not because she was weak, but because the weight of being seen all at once was almost unbearable. "You do not remember," she said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Then, after a pause so soft it felt like the room itself was holding its breath, she added, "That is what hurt most." Adrian's face changed. Something inside him broke open, not with sound, but with understanding. A forgotten night. A secret garden. A silver thread tied around a wrist. His mother's voice, far away and cold, warning him that mercy could be dangerous when you belonged to a throne. He had been young then, and proud, and blinded by the need to be what others expected. He had walked away from the one person who had looked at him with no fear at all. His eyes returned to Elena, and for the first time he truly saw her as she was now, not plain, not fragile, not unimportant. A woman standing in stillness so complete it was its own kind of power. The room seemed to shrink around them. Even the windows, with their dark panes and winter frost, felt farther away. "Why?" he asked at last, and the question came rougher than he intended. Elena gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Because I was tired of waiting for you to notice what everyone else had already buried." Adrian stared at her as if the floor had shifted beneath him. For the first time in years, the court could see something it had not been prepared for. The Alpha King was afraid. Not of war. Not of enemies. Of the truth standing quietly in front of him, with silver at her lips and history in her eyes. The room held its breath as Elena sat in perfect stillness, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the silver cup as if it were no more than a piece of polished glass. No one spoke. No one moved. The court, so proud a moment ago, now seemed to tremble under the weight of what it had witnessed. Adrian remained where he stood, but something in him had already crossed the distance between them. The arrogance that had worn his face like armor was gone, stripped away by the quiet truth in her eyes. He had spent years telling himself that duty came before feeling, that a king could not afford weakness, that the mate he had left behind was a regret best buried beneath ceremony and power. But regret had a way of surviving where pride did not. It lived in the silence between heartbeats. It lived in the memory of a girl standing in moonlight, waiting for a kindness he never gave. Elena watched him struggle with that realization, and pity did not soften her expression. She had no need to rescue him from it. He had done that to himself. At last, He took one careful step forward, then another, as if the air around her had turned sacred and he feared breaking it. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Elena did not answer at once. Her gaze drifted past him, over the marble floor, the gold banners, the frozen faces of the nobles who once called her unworthy. Then she looked back at him, calm and unafraid. "Long enough," she said. The answer landed harder than any shout could have. Adrian swallowed, his throat tight with things he could not say. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. He had expected pleas. Instead, she gave him the one thing he had never earned from her, restraint. It unsettled him more than accusation ever could. Around them, whispers began to rise again, cautious and broken. One noblewoman pressed a hand to her mouth. Another lowered her eyes. The old healer at the side of the hall took a slow step forward, drawn by the change in the air. He had known the truth before anyone else had dared to name it, and now that the secret stood exposed, it seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. Elena's scent, once hidden beneath the poison and the perfume and the years of being overlooked, carried something deeper now. Something ancient. Something that made the older wolves straighten without understanding why. Adrian noticed it too. His face changed, the color draining from his expression as memory surfaced with painful clarity. The nights she had been ill and no one came. The days she stood near him, silent and patient, while he praised the wrong people and ignored the one who had always been there. The faint silver thread at her wrist, once a simple mark from a healing charm, now glimmered like a promise he had failed to keep. His voice came lower, rough with disbelief. "You should have told me." Elena almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Would it have mattered? The question did not need an answer. It hung between them like winter breath. Adrian looked as though he had been struck by his own memory. For the first time since he had entered the hall, the Alpha King seemed smaller than the woman before him. Not because she had risen above him in power, though perhaps she had, but because she had endured what he had not seen, and still stood with her dignity intact. He had taken everything from her that a careless heart could take, and she had survived it without becoming cruel. That was what frightened him most. Not her pain. Her grace. Elena did not speak right away. The hall was still too quiet, as if the entire court had forgotten how to breathe. Across the polished floor, servants stood frozen with their trays. Nobles kept their eyes lowered. Even the musicians near the far wall had fallen silent, their hands suspended above strings and keys. Only Adrian remained in motion, though barely. He had taken one step toward her and then stopped, as if some invisible force had reached out and held him in place. His face had gone pale beneath the hard lines of his title. The Alpha King who had entered this hall with command in his posture now looked like a man standing at the edge of a truth he had spent years avoiding. Elena kept her chin lifted. The silver cup was still in her hand, though her fingers had gone almost white around the stem. There was no panic in her expression. No tears. Only a deep, steady hurt that had settled so long ago it no longer needed permission to exist. Adrian looked at her as though he could suddenly see every quiet moment he had missed. Every time she had waited. Every time she had spoken and he had not truly heard her. Every time she had stood a little behind the others, patient and graceful, while the world praised louder voices and prettier promises. He swallowed hard. "Elena," he said, and her name sounded different now, stripped of ceremony and power. It sounded like regret. She gave a faint, tired smile, the kind that never reached the eyes. "You are looking at me as if this is the first time," she said softly. "It is not." That was the cruelest part. Not that he had failed once, but that he had failed many times, and each failure had been quiet enough for the court to mistake it for nothing at all. Adrian's gaze dropped to the silver cup, then lifted again. For one brief moment, the careful king was gone, and only the man remained. The man who remembered her voice in the garden at dawn. The man who remembered the way her hand had steadied his when fever made the world blur. The man who had mistaken her patience for something that would never break. His throat moved. "I did not know," he said. Elena's eyes softened, but only with sadness. "No," she replied. "You did not ask." The words landed without force, and yet they shook him more than any accusation could have. Around them, the court seemed to shrink into the background, every noble face becoming a blur of color and shame. Adrian took another step, slower this time, like a man approaching a sacred place he no longer deserved to enter. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, and the question came out raw, almost unrecognizable. Elena lowered the cup just enough for the moonlight to touch the rim and flash silver across her fingers. "There are some things," she said, "that cannot be undone by asking nicely." Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if the truth itself had weight. When he opened them again, the arrogance that had once lived there was gone completely. In its place was something far more dangerous to him. Humility. Real, painful, irreversible humility. He looked at her as though he had finally understood that the woman before him was not fragile, not lesser, not a mistake waiting to be corrected. She was the one thing he had never truly earned. And now she was the one thing he could not bear to lose again. The silence did not break easily. It hung over the banquet hall like a veil of winter glass, thin and sharp and impossible to ignore. Elena still stood at the center of it all, her silver cup lowered now, her shoulders straight, her face calm in a way that unsettled every person watching her. She had expected judgment long before this night. She had lived inside it for years. What she had not expected was to see it fade from Adrian's eyes and leave behind something so raw it almost made him look young. He remained several steps away, as if he knew that coming closer too quickly would only remind her of every time he had not come at all. Around them, the court had gone still in the uneasy way people did when they realized they were no longer observing a scandal, but standing in the middle of a reckoning. Adrian finally spoke, and his voice was low enough that it felt meant for her alone. "Tell me what happened after I left." The question was so simple that it nearly made her laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was late. Far too late. Elena's fingers tightened around the stem of the cup, not from fear, but from the memory of every door that had closed, every message that had been ignored, every kind word she had once offered and watched turn useless in her hands. She looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her tone stayed measured, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You left me in a house where no one was allowed to say my name without permission," she said. "You left me with people who smiled when I apologized for existing. You left me in a world where I was expected to become smaller every day so others would not feel uncomfortable standing near my sorrow." Adrian's jaw tightened. He did not interrupt. He could not. Not when every word landed with the weight of truth. Elena's gaze drifted past him for a moment, toward the long table where nobles sat in frozen clusters, their faces pale with the realization that the story they had built around her had been wrong in every cruel detail. She saw the woman who had once mocked her with practiced sweetness. She saw the man who had laughed when she was sent away from the healing wing. She saw all of them, and for the first time, none of them mattered. Not because they had changed, but because she had. "I spent months trying to survive quietly," she said. "I learned how to walk without being noticed. How to speak only when spoken to. How to make myself useful enough to remain in a room, but never important enough to be protected in it." Her voice did not tremble. That was what made it unbearable. Adrian lowered his head, as if each sentence were pressing him down inch by inch. "Elena," he said, but his voice broke before he could finish. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She had learned how to read the smallest fractures in people long before they admitted to having any. For a moment, the only sound in the hall was the faint crackle of candle flames. Then, from somewhere near the side doors, came the soft rustle of movement as a servant quietly set down a tray and stepped back, as though even the smallest noise might shatter the moment entirely. Elena drew a slow breath. When she looked at Adrian again, her expression had not turned cold. That was the strange mercy of her. She had not become hard just because the world had been. I am not here to punish you, she said. If I wanted revenge, I would have chosen a louder ending. Adrian flinched at that, because he understood exactly what she meant. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to. The restraint in her words cut deeper than anger would have. He took another step forward, then stopped himself again, as if asking permission with his body before he dared ask with his words. Then tell me what you want, he said. Whatever it is, I will do it. Elena let the question sit between them. Once, she would have wanted him to say those words years earlier, when they might have meant something that could still be saved. Now they arrived like a confession from a man staring at the ruins of a life he had helped destroy. She set the silver cup on the table beside her with careful precision, the soft sound echoing in the hush. What I want, she said, is for you to stop looking at me as if you are discovering my worth for the first time. The words landed cleanly. No anger. No dramatics. Only truth. Adrian's face changed. Pain crossed it first, then shame, then something quieter and far more devastating. Recognition. He had looked at her before and seen absence where there had been endurance, weakness where there had been patience, silence where there had been survival. Now every one of those false judgments came back to him like an accusation. Elena lifted her chin slightly. Not in defiance. In balance. I was always here, she said. You simply did not know how to see me. And in that one sentence, the room seemed to shift around them. The court had not just lost its composure. It had lost its certainty. Adrian stood before her like a man stripped of every excuse he had ever used to protect himself from regret. He had begun this night believing he was in control of the story. Now he understood he had only been living in the part of it he preferred to remember. Elena did not wait for him to answer. She did not need his apology to survive the next breath. But when she turned slightly toward the moonlit windows and the silver on her fingertips caught the light, Adrian saw something there that made his chest tighten with a new kind of fear. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the terrible, quiet possibility that she might walk away from him with her dignity intact, and that he would deserve every step of it. Elena did not look at the cup when it was taken from her hands. She looked at Adrian. Not because she wanted to see his fear, though it was there in plain sight, but because she had waited too long to stop meeting his gaze. The hall remained frozen around them, every noble holding still as if movement itself might tip the night into something irreversible. Adrian stood at the center of it all, no longer like a ruler commanding a feast, but like a man listening to the sound of his own ruin. Elena's face did not change. That was the cruelest thing about her grace. It gave no easy answer to lean on. It offered no dramatic collapse, no trembling confession, no plea for mercy. She had already survived the moment he had once assumed would destroy her. You keep looking at me, she said quietly, as if the truth is something you can still negotiate with. The words did not rise. They did not need to. They reached him anyway, clear as the strike of a bell in a silent chapel. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He could not. For once, the court saw the difference between power and shame. Power filled a room. Shame emptied it. Elena's hands rested lightly at her sides, and the silver tint at her fingertips caught the candlelight like a warning no one had listened to in time. She remembered the years in fragments, not because she was weak, but because memory had a way of sharpening what pain tried to blur. The cold corridors. The dismissed warnings. The way people had smiled when they should have questioned. The way she had learned to make herself small enough to survive in a place that had never intended to protect her. And now, standing beneath the chandeliers, she understood something with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. She had never needed their permission to be real. That truth settled over her like a cloak. Not heavy. Not bitter. Just final. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped, as if his own body had refused to cooperate with his pride. His voice, when it came, was lower than before. Elena. It was not an order. It was not even a demand. It was the sound of a man reaching for someone he had already failed to hold. She did not soften. She had no reason to. Instead, she lifted her eyes to the watching court and spoke with a steadiness that made several nobles look away. "You all knew how to praise me when I was useful," she said. "But when I was overlooked, when I was hurting, when I needed one honest voice in the room, none of you found your courage." No one answered. The silence was answer enough. Adrian's throat moved once. He looked as if he wanted to deny what she had said, but denial had become too expensive for him now. Every face in the hall reflected the same terrible realization. They had all been present. They had all seen enough to question. And they had all chosen comfort over truth. Elena turned the silver cup slowly in her hand, not drinking now, only holding what remained of the night like a memory she had already outlived. "I do not need you to understand everything tonight," she said. "I only need you to understand that I was not broken by what you refused to see." Adrian's shoulders lowered by the smallest amount, as though the weight of that sentence had found its place on him. Then, from somewhere near the back of the hall, a single chair scraped softly against the floor. The sound was small, but it carried. Every head turned. A man in a dark cloak had risen from the shadows near the archway, his face partly hidden, his posture calm in a way that seemed almost familiar. He said nothing at first. He only watched Elena with a stillness that felt too deliberate to be chance. And when Adrian saw the expression in his eyes, something old and buried shifted inside him. Not recognition yet. Worse. The suspicion of it. The stranger in the dark cloak did not move, but the air around him seemed to tighten anyway. Elena felt it first, a faint shift in the room, the kind that came before a storm when even the candles seemed to hesitate. Adrian's gaze stayed locked on the figure near the archway, and for one unbearable moment, the entire hall remained suspended between recognition and denial. Then the stranger lowered his hood. He was older than the kind of men who usually came to court, with silver at his temples and a face carved by patience rather than vanity, but it was the eyes that changed everything. Adrian went very still. Elena saw the color drain from his face before he managed to hide it. "No," he said, and the word came out rough, almost broken. The stranger inclined his head with quiet courtesy. "Your Majesty," he replied. "It has been a long time." No one in the hall seemed to know whether to bow or flee. Elena did not look away. She watched Adrian as the truth gathered itself inside him, slow and merciless. The man before them was not a servant. He was not a messenger. He was the royal physician who had vanished years ago after the last winter fever, the one person Adrian had once trusted to keep the palace archives sealed and the old blood records hidden. And if he had returned now, after all this time, then it was not by accident. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped, as though even his own body no longer trusted him. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The physician's eyes flicked, briefly, to Elena. "I was sent for," he said. "By someone who believed the truth should no longer remain buried." Elena's fingers tightened faintly around the silver cup. She had not asked for this moment, and yet it came to her like dawn through cracked stone, unwelcome and necessary. The hall seemed smaller now. The nobles who had once watched her with polite indifference were suddenly staring at the floor, at the walls, at anywhere except the woman standing at the center of their silence. They had all learned too late that truth had a way of arriving dressed as consequence. Adrian's voice lowered. "What truth?" The physician did not answer him immediately. Instead, he reached into the inner fold of his cloak and withdrew a thin leather folio, worn soft at the edges by years of being hidden and handled in secret. He held it with both hands, not as evidence, but as something sacred. Elena's breath caught before she understood why. Adrian saw it too. "Do not," he said, but there was no force in it anymore. The physician opened the folio and turned it so that the nearest candles caught the ink. "Names," Dates. Bloodline marks. Old seals from the healer's chamber. Records that should have been burned, but had survived long enough to accuse everyone who had tried to erase them. Elena felt the room tilt, not because she was shocked, but because some deep, weary part of her had always known there was more. She had felt it in the way the palace healers had paused when she entered. In the way certain servants had avoided her eyes. In the way her own body had reacted to Silver with a pain she had been told was simple weakness. "She was your true mate," the physician said quietly. The words did not thunder. They did not need to. They fell into the hall with the weight of something that had waited years for permission to speak. Adrian's mouth parted, but nothing came out. Elena closed her eyes for one brief second. Not from shame. From exhaustion. For so long, she had been made to carry the sorrow of a truth nobody else wanted. Now it stood in the open, and still it did not feel like victory. It felt like grief finally given a name. Adrian looked at the folio, then at Elena, and at last the full horror of what he had done seemed to arrive all at once. Not in a shout. Not in a collapse. In the silence between heartbeats. He had not simply dismissed her. He had poisoned the one bond fate had placed in his hands, and he had done it while believing he was choosing wisely. Elena saw the realization strike him and, for the first time that night, she did not harden against it. She only watched. The physician turned another page. "The silver compound was never meant to reach her," he said. "It was prepared for another purpose, stored in the royal infirmary, and removed without proper clearance. Someone altered the records. Someone ensured the warning never reached the king." A faint murmur moved through the court, like wind through dead leaves. Adrian's jaw clenched. His eyes shifted slowly through the crowd, searching for the shape of betrayal in faces that had once sworn loyalty. But Elena was no longer interested in his search. She had already lived through too many moments where blame mattered less than survival. "Do you see now?" she asked him, and her voice was steady enough to hurt. "I was never the mistake." Adrian looked at her as if her words had struck him deeper than any accusation could. And because the night was not finished with them yet, because truth always opened one door only to reveal another, the physician spoke once more. "There is something else," he said. The hall fell silent again. Elena felt the old, familiar ache stir in her chest, not with fear this time, but with the strange, fragile hope of a wound that had finally been touched by the light. The physician met Adrian's stunned gaze and said, "The person who moved the poison was not acting alone." The physician's words did not settle into the room all at once. They moved through it slowly, like cold light sliding across a floor no one had dared to cross. Elena felt every face turn toward him, then toward Adrian, then back again, as if the hall itself had become a courtroom and the truth had finally found its voice. Adrian did not speak. He stood very still, one hand braced against the edge of the table, his knuckles pale beneath the candlelight. For the first time all night, he looked uncertain in a way that no crown could hide. The physician folded his hands behind his back and continued, calm and precise. "The silver poison was not the only substance in that cup," he said. "It was masked. Altered by someone who knew exactly how to hide the scent." A murmur moved through the court. Elena did not look at the nobles. She had spent too long being watched, judged, measured, and dismissed by people who never once asked what she had survived. Her attention stayed on Adrian, because this was the moment he could no longer turn away from. The moment where regret either became truth, or stayed hidden forever. "Who?" he asked at last. His voice was rougher than before. The physician's gaze drifted toward the far end of the hall, where one of the attendants stood motionless near the marble column. She was young, with lowered eyes and a carefully folded expression that almost passed for innocence. But Elena saw the pulse jump in the woman's throat. Adrian saw it too. The silence between them sharpened. "She was instructed," the physician said. "Not to kill. To delay. To weaken. To make the symptoms appear natural." The attendant's breath caught. A few guests gasped softly. No one moved. Elena felt the strange calm of a person who had already fallen and survived the fall. There was no shock left in her for the court. Only the quiet ache of confirmation, and the bitter relief of finally knowing that her instincts had never lied to her. Adrian turned slowly toward the attendant. By whom? He asked, but this time there was no command in his voice. Only a man standing at the edge of his own ruin. The attendant's lips trembled. For one terrible second, Elena thought she might refuse to answer. Instead, she whispered a name that cracked the room open. It was one of Adrian's most trusted advisors. The man who had stood beside him during councils. The man who had smiled at Elena while speaking kindly to her and asking questions no kind man should ever ask. Adrian went perfectly still. The color drained from his face in a way that made him look suddenly human, and far too young for the weight he was carrying. That is not possible, one noble said from the side of the hall, but even he sounded uncertain. The physician only lifted his chin. It is possible. And there is more. Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. The room seemed to narrow around his next words. The advisor did not act alone. There were records altered, entries removed, herbs replaced in the apothecary stores. This was planned over time. The hall went silent in the deepest way silence could go. Not the silence of peace. The silence of people realizing that something rotten had been growing beneath their feet for far too long. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment. She did not do it to hide from the truth. She did it because truth, at last, had become heavy enough to hold. When she opened them again, Adrian was looking at her as if he were seeing the full shape of the disaster for the first time. Not only her pain. Not only his mistake. But the long, ugly path that had led them both to this room. Elena, he said, and her name sounded broken in his mouth. She almost answered. Almost. But there was still one more name left to be spoken, and they both knew it. The physician reached into his coat and drew out a small, sealed packet wrapped in waxed paper. This was found hidden in the advisor's quarters, he said. And it changes everything. Elena stared at the packet, feeling the air tighten around her ribs. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped. For once, he did not rush to command the room into obedience. He waited. The physician broke the seal and unfolded the paper with careful hands. Inside was a note. Only a few lines. But when Elena read the first sentence, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The handwriting was elegant. Familiar. Cruel in its neatness. It was not just a confession. It was a warning. And beneath it, in a second hand, sharper and more hurried, were the words that made Elena's breath stop altogether. If the king learns what truly happened to his real mate, he will never forgive himself. The hall blurred around the edges. Adrian looked from the paper to Elena, and something in his expression broke cleanly apart. The physician's voice was almost gentle when he said, "There is no misunderstanding left." This was done to her on purpose. Elena's heart beat once, hard and aching, in the stillness that followed. The room was no longer waiting for an explanation. It was waiting for judgment. And for the first time, Adrian looked at her not as someone he had lost, but as the woman whose truth had been hidden from him until it was almost too late. The room did not move for a long moment, as if even the candles were afraid to breathe. Elena stood at the center of it all with the note in her hands, the paper trembling only once before her fingers closed around it with careful strength. Adrian watched her from across the table, and for the first time since the night had begun, he looked like a man stripped of every defense he had ever trusted. The physician remained still beside him, his face calm in the way only truth could make it. No one spoke. Not the nobles. Not the guards. Not the servants hovering at the edge of the hall with lowered eyes. The silence was not empty anymore. It was full of consequence. Elena lifted her gaze from the page and met Adrian's eyes without flinching. In that look was no plea, no hope of softening what had been done. Only the quiet dignity of someone who had already survived what should have broken her. Adrian felt that look land deeper than any accusation could have. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was understanding. The kind that made every excuse in the world sound childish and late. The physician broke the stillness at last. The poison was not meant to silence her by accident, he said, his voice steady enough to carry across the hall. It was prepared with knowledge. It was chosen carefully. And it was given to the wrong woman by people who wanted the truth buried forever. A murmur moved through the hall like a cold wind. Adrian turned slowly toward the servant who had delivered the cup, then toward the men standing near the side doors, and the pieces began to gather in his mind with sickening clarity. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But enough. Enough to make his jaw tighten. Enough to make the weight of his own failures feel unbearable. Elena did not look away from him. She wanted him to feel it. Not for revenge. For recognition. For the first time, she wanted the truth to stand between them with no more shadows left to hide in. Adrian took one step forward, then stopped. The distance between them had never felt so wide. Elena, he said, and his voice was rough now, stripped of command, stripped of pride. Just a man speaking to the woman he had failed. She did not answer right away. The hall seemed to wait with her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than shouting ever could. You keep looking at me like I am a mistake you can still correct, she said. But I was never the error, Adrian. I was the truth you refused to see. His face changed at that, pain moving through it like a shadow across water. He had no answer ready. No order. No declaration. Nothing left but the raw, awful knowledge that everything he had trusted had been built on lies spoken around her, over her, and against her. The physician stepped closer to Elena and lowered his head, not in pity, but in respect. The note confirms what the evidence already showed, he said. This was done with intention. Someone knew exactly who she was. A fresh silence followed those words. It settled over the hall like snow. Then Elena unfolded the note one more time and read the final line aloud, her voice almost soft enough to be mistaken for mercy. If he ever learns the truth, he will have to live with what he has done. No one moved. Adrian closed his eyes. For one brief second, the proud Alpha King looked less like a ruler and more like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, finally seeing how far he had fallen. When he opened them again, they were fixed on Elena with a new and terrible clarity. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew better than that now. Instead, he lowered his head. It was not dramatic. It was not for the court. It was only for her. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the chance to regret this properly, he said. The words were simple, and that made them heavier. Elena felt something inside her loosen, not into peace, but into the first honest ache of release. Not because his pain repaired hers. It did not. Some things could never be repaired. But because the lie had finally ended. Because her name had finally been spoken without contempt. Because the room had at last been forced to see what had stood in it all along. Outside, beyond the tall arched windows, dawn was beginning to thin the darkness over the kingdom. Pale light spilled across the floor in long silver bands, touching the edge of the table, the physician's sleeve, Adrian's bowed head, and Elena's steady hands. It made everything look different and the same at once. Not healed. Not whole. But honest. Elena folded the note carefully and held it to her chest. Then, without looking back, she turned toward the doors. No one stopped her. No one dared. And as she walked toward the first light of morning, the entire hall remained frozen behind her, listening to the sound of a woman choosing herself at last. The first light of morning had barely touched the palace windows when Elena stepped beyond the great doors and into the quiet air of the courtyard. The kingdom was still holding its breath. Even the fountain at the center of the stone path seemed softer now, its silver water catching the dawn in trembling threads. Behind her, the hall remained full of silence and stunned faces, but she did not turn back. For the first time in years, she could feel the world without waiting for someone else to name what she was worth. The note rested against her chest beneath one hand, warm from her body, light as paper and heavy as truth. She had expected grief to come all at once, sharp and crushing, but what moved through her instead was stranger than that. It was a slow unraveling. A quiet ache. The kind that came when a soul had carried too much for too long and was finally allowed to put something down. Adrian had followed to the threshold, but no further. He stood there as if the air itself had become a wall between them. His face was pale in the morning light, stripped of every mask that had once made him seem untouchable. There was no command in him now, no cold certainty, no practiced distance. Only a man who had arrived too late to stop what he had already set in motion. Elena saw that clearly, and it did not soften the wound. It only made it real. "Elena," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now. Not like ownership. Not like dismissal. Like regret. She did not answer. She kept walking until the stones beneath her feet gave way to the garden path, where pale white roses bent in the wind and dew gathered along the leaves like small, quiet tears. The physician walked beside her for a while without speaking. He had the kind of silence that did not demand anything. It simply made room. After several steps, he said gently, "You should not have had to endure that alone." Elena let out a breath that shook once before it steadied. "I did endure it alone," she said. Her voice was not bitter. It was honest. "But I am not alone now." The physician lowered his eyes, and something like respect moved across his expression. Ahead of them, the gates of the inner garden were opening with the slow creak of old iron. Beyond them lay the road that led down through the kingdom, out toward the villages and the forest line, toward a world that had continued turning whether she had been seen or not. She could leave. That was the first strange gift of the morning. Not forgiveness. Not restoration. Simply choice. And yet as she reached the gates, the wind shifted. It carried a scent she had not noticed in years, faint and familiar, threaded through the cold and the stone and the roses. It made her stop. Not in fear. In memory. The feeling came like a door opening somewhere deep inside her, a place she had sealed long ago because there had been no other way to survive. Her fingers curled slightly around the note, and for a moment, the world around her blurred at the edges. She saw flashes that were not quite images and not quite dreams, a hand reaching through darkness, a voice calling her by another name, a promise spoken near the moon when she was younger and not yet broken by betrayal. Her heart gave one strange, hard beat. The physician noticed the change in her before she could hide it. "What is it?" he asked softly. Elena looked toward the path beyond the garden, where the morning mist drifted low over the hedges. Her expression had gone still, but beneath that stillness something had awakened. Something old. Something that had never truly died. "I remember a scent," she said at last, her voice barely above the wind. "I remember it from before all of this." The physician said nothing. He only watched her as understanding began to gather in the quiet between them. Not complete understanding. Not yet. But enough to show that the truth was not finished with her. Elena lifted her chin and looked toward the rising sun, where the first gold of day spread gently across the kingdom's walls. Whatever had been taken from her, whatever had been hidden, whatever name had once belonged to her before the poison and the lies, it was no longer buried in the dark. The dawn had touched it. And somewhere behind her, in the palace she was leaving with careful, measured steps, Adrian had finally begun to understand that the woman walking away was not a memory he could reclaim. She was the truth he had failed to protect. Elena took one last breath of the cold morning air and walked forward into the light. The morning air felt cooler outside the palace, but Elena no longer felt as if it belonged to her old life. Each step across the courtyard was careful, quiet and steady, as though she were learning the shape of freedom one breath at a time. The physician walked beside her without speaking, carrying the same grave patience he had shown inside the hall. At last, when the fountain came into view, he slowed and said gently, "There is something else you are remembering, even if you do not yet have the words for it." Elena stopped near the edge of the stone path. The silver light of dawn touched her hands, and for a brief moment she stared at them as if they were unfamiliar. "I am remembering pieces," she said softly. "Not the whole truth. Just flashes. A room. A voice. Warmth. And then nothing." The physician studied her face with care, as if he feared too much pressure might scatter the fragile new memory before it could settle. "That is often how the body returns what it was forced to hide," he replied. Elena lowered her gaze to the fountain, where the water moved in delicate ripples. There was a calmness in it that almost hurt to look at, because it reminded her of everything she had not been allowed to feel before. The fear. The confusion. The years of being told to doubt herself. And now this strange, aching certainty that something precious had been stolen from her long before the poison entered the story. She drew in a slow breath. "If I was meant to forget," she murmured, "why does it feel like my heart never did?" The physician did not answer immediately. In the soft light, his expression turned thoughtful, almost sorrowful. "Because the heart remembers what the mind is made to bury," he said. Elena looked up at the palace windows in the distance. Behind those walls, Adrian was no longer the same man who had once let silence stand between them. She could feel that change even from here, like a pressure in the air that had shifted after a storm. He had finally seen her truth, but seeing was not the same as understanding. And understanding was not the same as earning her trust. That thought should have felt heavy. Instead, it felt clean. Honest. It gave shape to the next step. Elena folded her hands before her and asked, "If there is more, will it come back?" The physician nodded once. "If it was taken by force, then healing will not be fast. But it will come. Memories often return when they are met with safety." Safety. The word settled over her like a soft blanket she had never been given in time. For a moment, she almost laughed at how foreign it sounded. But she did not. Her smile was small, tired, and real. "Then I want to be safe enough to remember," she said. The physician inclined his head, as if that alone was a vow worth honoring. Somewhere inside the palace, a door opened and closed, and the distant sound echoed faintly over the courtyard. Elena did not turn. She no longer flinched at every sound behind her. The world was still uncertain, still fragile, but something inside her had begun to stand upright again. Not as a shadow. Not as a wound. As herself. And for the first time, that was enough to make the morning feel like the beginning of something beautiful. By late morning, Elena had already begun to understand that healing did not arrive like a miracle. It came in small, almost invisible ways. In the way the physician offered her water before she asked. In the way the corridor servants lowered their eyes, no longer from fear, but from something closer to shame. In the way no one spoke her name as if it were a curse. She stood in a sunlit sitting room near the east wing, her fingers resting lightly over the edge of a pale wooden chair, when a maid came quietly to the door and announced that the Alpha King had requested to see her. The room seemed to tighten around the words. Even now, his presence could turn the air still. Elena did not answer at once. She looked down at her hands, at the calm they were trying so hard to learn, and breathed in slowly. "Does he know why I was ill?" she asked at last. The maid hesitated. "He knows only that you are recovering." That was not an answer, but it was enough. Adrian would have to live for a while inside uncertainty, the same way she had. Elena rose from the chair without hurry. When she passed the mirror by the doorway, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her face was softer in the daylight, but there was something firmer beneath the tiredness now, something that had survived being overlooked. The physician met her in the hall and nodded toward the private garden beyond the glass doors. "He is waiting there," he said gently. "If you wish to keep your distance, I will understand." Elena almost smiled at that. Distance. It had once been forced on her. Now it was a choice, and the difference mattered more than she could explain. She stepped into the garden alone. The air was warm, carrying the clean scent of roses and damp earth. Adrian stood near the stone fountain with his hands behind his back, but he did not look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man who had been brought to the edge of his own regret and had found no mercy waiting there. When he saw her, he straightened at once, yet he did not move closer. "You should have more time to rest," he said. His voice was quieter than she remembered, worn thin by sleeplessness. Elena studied him for a long moment. This was the man who had never once seen her pain clearly until it became impossible to ignore. This was the man who had let a truth die in silence. And yet, standing there beneath the morning light, he was also only a man standing before the wreckage of what he had not understood. "I am resting," she said. "For the first time in a long while, I think I finally am." Something in his face changed then. Not relief. Not yet. But a painful recognition, as if her words had landed exactly where they were meant to. He took a careful breath. "Elena," he began, then stopped. The sound of her name on his tongue carried too much history to be harmless. She waited. He looked toward the fountain, then back to her. "I have spent the last several days asking myself how I could have missed what was in front of me." His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in grief. "I do not ask you to forgive me. I know I have no right to ask for that." The honesty in it made the garden feel even quieter. Elena let the silence stay between them long enough to become real. Then she said, "No. You do not have the right to ask. But you do have the chance to listen now." He met her eyes at last, and for a moment he looked younger than his title, stripped down to the bare man beneath the crown. "Then I will listen," he said. It was such a simple answer that it almost hurt. Elena looked away first, toward the roses bending slightly in the breeze. The sunlight touched their petals with a softness that made her chest ache. "When I remember," she said slowly, "I do not want the memory to be taken from me again. If there is truth waiting, I want to face it awake." Adrian nodded once, the motion heavy with understanding. "Then nothing will be hidden from you again." He said it as a vow, not a promise made lightly. A gust of wind moved through the garden and stirred the leaves overhead. Somewhere beyond the walls, the kingdom went on breathing, carrying its old habits and old silences. But here, beside the fountain, something had shifted. Not healed completely. Not yet. But changed. Elena drew a quiet breath and lifted her chin. "I am not asking to be protected from the truth," she said. "I am asking to be strong enough to survive it." Adrian looked at her as if he had never heard a braver sentence. And in that still, bright garden, with the roses swaying and the morning deepening around them, he understood at last that her future would not be decided by his guilt. It would be shaped by her own return to herself. The first crack of sunlight glimmered against the fountain water, and Elena felt it not as warning, but as beginning. By the time the kingdom's bells began to ring at dusk, Elena was no longer standing at the center of anyone else's ruin. She stood beside the palace garden fountain with the evening light resting softly over her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like a secret being carried through a dark house. She felt seen. Not by the crowd, not by the court, but by the quiet truth that had survived everything they had tried to bury. Adrian remained a few steps away, not because he was afraid to come closer, but because he had finally learned that love could not be demanded from someone who had only just learned to breathe again. He watched her with the stillness of a man who had lost too much and understood too late what it meant. Elena turned her face toward the last gold light of the day, and the soft wind moved through the roses around them as if the garden itself had chosen mercy. The physician had already said the silver poison would take time to leave her body, but the greater healing was happening somewhere deeper, where no medicine could reach. It was in the way her hands no longer trembled when she lifted a cup. In the way her shoulders had stopped folding inward whenever a voice rose too sharply. In the way she could say her own name now without sounding like she was asking permission to exist. Adrian took one careful step forward. "If there is any part of this that I can still make right," he said quietly, "I will spend the rest of my life doing it." Elena did not answer at once. She looked at him, not with the softness he had once mistaken for weakness, but with the calm of a woman who had survived the truth and chosen not to be consumed by it. "You cannot return what was lost," she said, her voice gentle, almost sad. "But you can stop asking forgiveness like it is something you deserve more than I deserve peace." The words landed between them with the weight of dusk settling over the garden. Adrian lowered his eyes. For the first time, he did not defend himself. He did not explain. He did not try to reach for the past as if regret alone could rebuild it. He only stood there and listened, because that was the first honest thing he had done in a very long time. The fountain whispered beside them. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the kingdom was changing in small, patient ways. Servants walked with straighter backs. Guards spoke more softly. Old names lost their power when spoken in the light. And for the first time, the court did not feel like a place built to break the gentle. It felt like a place learning, slowly and painfully, how to bow to them instead. Elena looked toward the open garden gate where the evening breeze drifted in from the city beyond. Freedom no longer looked like escape. It looked like choice. It looked like mornings without fear. It looked like a future that had not yet decided its shape. Adrian followed her gaze and understood that her life would not be measured by what he had done to her, but by what she chose after him. That knowledge hurt, but it also healed something in him that guilt had kept frozen for too long. He swallowed, then said, "If you ever wish to leave this palace, I will not stop you." Elena's lips parted slightly, as if the sincerity of it surprised her more than the words themselves. The old Adrian would have clung. The old Adrian would have begged. But this one only watched her, giving her the dignity he had once denied her. Slowly, Elena reached down and brushed her fingers against the edge of a white rose blooming beside the fountain. Its petals trembled in the wind, delicate and unafraid. She smiled then, a real smile, small but undeniable, carrying no surrender in it at all. "I know," she said. "That is why I can stay, if I choose to." The answer was not a promise of love. It was something stronger. It was the return of trust, fragile and incomplete, but alive. Adrian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Above them, the first stars began to appear, one by one, soft against the deepening blue. Elena looked up at the sky, and in that quiet moment, she felt the strange and beautiful truth of survival. Not that the wound had vanished. Not that the past had been erased. But that she had walked through it and still reached the light. Adrian followed her gaze, and for once, he did not see a woman he had lost. He saw a soul he had nearly destroyed, now standing beneath the evening sky with her chin lifted and her heart still beating toward tomorrow. And when Elena finally stepped away from the fountain and toward the open garden gate, she did not walk like someone fleeing. She walked like someone becoming. Adrian did not call her back. He only watched her go, knowing that some endings were not punishments, but blessings. Not all love returned. Not all guilt was forgiven. But sometimes, if the truth was met with enough humility, what remained could still become something gentle. Something honest. Something worthy of the light. And as Elena disappeared into the twilight beyond the roses, the palace behind her no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place that had finally learned, too late but truly, the cost of mistaking a good woman for something disposable.